I've been pretty fortunate to always have been able to work from home, even long before the whole COVID lockdown changed things so much. I've always been able to keep my own hours too, and this was helpful to me because I was a night person. I would often keep up all night long and go to sleep during the middle of the day. This really fit my personality. I'm already not much of a people person anyway. I mean, I like people well enough, don't get me wrong, but I'm really the sort of awkward person that just prefers to spend time by myself. Being like this, I often went out at night to get things too. There was this tiny convenience store a little ways outside my neighborhood that I liked to go to quite often. It was a bit of a liquor store, I guess, but they sold some things other than just alcohol. This took place during the winter time, and it was actually snowing pretty damn hard outside. I was wanting something to keep my energy up, so I decided to run down to the convenience store real quick and grab myself an energy drink. It was pretty late at night, but I can't recall exactly how late it was. Due to both the time and the falling snow, it was of course completely dead outside. I always liked hearing the sound of my own feet crunching in the new snow when I walked. There was just something relaxing about it. When I had left, I hadn't expected the snow to be falling quite as hard as it was now though. There was very little visibility outside. Fortunately, there was no one out driving, so I could walk out the side of the road without worrying about being run over or something. When I got to the store, I noticed someone standing outside smoking a cigarette. I gave them the same friendly wave that everyone in my town always gave to each other, which was returned in kind. Then I walked into the store. I got myself a Sobe Orange Tsunami, which was my drink of choice at the time. When I went to pay for it, I noticed there was a new worker behind the counter. I greeted him, made some polite chat about how I'd been coming to this store for years and how the owners were really nice. I told him I'd probably be seeing a lot more of him since I shop there very often. The man seemed like a nice guy. When I turned to leave the store, the guy who was smoking was still there. As I got about a block away though, I turned around and noticed the man who had been smoking was now walking in my direction. I got that sort of nervous feeling I always get when I notice something strange like that. Remember, people already generally make me nervous, and that nervousness usually makes me assume someone is following me, even when they're most likely not. I turned off the road in town into the subdivision that I lived in. When I'd gotten about a block into it, I once again felt compelled to turn around suddenly. I just wanted to check and see if the guy was still following me. Turned around, and there he was. My nervousness increased even more. I had a bit more to walk before I'd be able to get home. I started to go faster. I had 2 more streets to go down. I would check to see if he was following me down them as well. When I made the next turn, I checked, and yeah, he'd made the same turn too. I was thinking this was very much not a coincidence. I began to go even faster. I only checked back once in a while and tried to make it seem casual. He must have sped up too though, because he was continuously gaining on me. He kept pace with me and was slowly catching up to me. Finally, I turned down my own street, and the pattern repeated itself once again. My mind was going in many different directions. Why was he still lagging behind and not trying to catch up to me harder? When I got to my yard, I sort of trotted up the driveway and got into the house quickly. I went in and looked out the window. I could see him standing a little ways down the street. He'd stopped walking and looked like he was talking to someone on his mobile phone. I got an idea then. I had a dog at the time, a pit bull. I thought I would let the dog out in the front yard as a sort of warning, just in case this guy was planning on robbing my house or something. When I took the dog out, I could tell the man was obviously startled. He wasn't on his phone anymore and continued walking. He gave me a wave as he passed by and walked past my house down the street and turned off down another random street. The whole thing was extremely strange, and I didn't know what to think about it. I was happy that my dog ploy had scared the guy away though. The next day, I was watching the news, and I got the shock of my life. The liquor store I had visited had been robbed the following night. The owner had been beaten very badly and was found laying behind the counter. That made me wonder if perhaps the person I thought was a new cashier was actually a robber who was just pretending. I wondered if the owner, the old man I had known for quite a while, had just been laying behind the counter while I was there. Well, I contacted the police about my suspicions. They had someone picked up already and wanted to know if I could identify them. It was the cashier and the man who had followed me home. It turns out they had been in the middle of robbing the store and had just beaten up the owner when I happened to come walking in. It occurred to me that maybe he followed me home to make sure I hadn't seen what they were doing. I felt really bad for the kind old man who owned the store. I felt really appreciative of my dog Randy as well. If he hadn't scared that guy off, I might have been in pretty bad condition that night as well. I've had some pretty messed up experiences involving my family in the past. I guess it would be safe to say that there's a lot of dysfunction in my extended family. One night when I was visiting one of my aunt's houses, the worst of all these experiences happened. My mom had 2 sisters, you see, and their children and us, we sort of grew up like we were siblings instead of cousins. I was the second oldest cousin at the time. And when this particular story takes place, I was the oldest of the kids who were involved. My mom took me and my younger brother, and we drove out to my aunt's house. She lived a pretty decent drive out into the country in West Virginia. The thought was that we were going to spend a few days there. My other aunt lived pretty close to that area too, so when she found out we were going to visit, she decided to come along as well. At the time, I was about 14. My younger brother was 9. The other cousin at the house was the one that lived there, and he was about 12 back then. Apparently, all the adults wanted to go out to the bars. They bought us some frozen pizzas and rented us some movies to watch while they went out on the town. My mom wasn't much of a drinker, but she liked to go along for the fun with her family. None of the 3 parents were married at the time, but my Aunt Claire, not the one whose house we were going to, had this on and off again tumultuous relationship with a guy named Jack. I knew that she and Jack would often get drunk here and there and have these really outrageous fights. Fortunately, I'd never had to bear witness to any of them before. I really hated seeing adults fighting over stupid shit, so I was really glad about that. At this time, I wasn't really good at confrontation with others. So, they all go out. They were out for quite a while as well. The 2 younger kids went to bed earlier, and us 2 older kids stayed up to watch the scary movie the adults had rented for us. I was sort of at that vague age where a movie could still scare me, so I was a little bit scared while watching. What happened during the rest of the night would become much more memorable than that movie was. The phone began to ring, and my cousin, since he lived there, went and answered it. He told me it was my mom and that she needed to talk to me. On the phone with my mom, she told me that my Aunt Claire had left the bar for a short time, but told her sisters she would be coming back. Well, she had never returned. Jack, however, had called the bar, seeing if Claire was there. She then asked me if I'd seen or heard from Claire either, and I let her know I hadn't seen anything. The last thing she told me was that if Claire showed up at the house at any point, and if Jack showed up later, to not let him know she was there. I said okay, already dreading the possibilities of what would be coming. I went back to the living room, now filled with dread and apprehension at what might happen later in the night. It wasn't too long before Aunt Claire arrived at the house and knocked on the door. I went to let her in. She was extremely intoxicated and looked like she'd been in a fierce fight. I immediately thought Jack must have beat her up or something and got even more freaked out. She went down to lay in my aunt's room. She didn't want me to call the police or anything like that, so I didn't really know what to do. All I really could do was what I'd been told. I let her go to sleep and then went back to the movie. About 15 minutes later, I began to hear a fierce pounding on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I knew it had to be Jack. I wondered what I should do. I figured I had to at least answer the door because he knew that we were there. I went to the door and saw it was indeed Jack. He asked me if Claire was there. He seemed extremely angry. I was nervous. I did my best to keep my cool and told him I hadn't seen her all night. He asked if I had heard anything from my mom and aunt, and I told him no as well. I noticed in the light that his hand was wrapped up in a bandana. I immediately thought he must have heard it hitting her or something. He was a big guy, and I was scared he was going to force his way into the trailer and look around on his own. It looked like he was thinking about it too. Just then though, thank God my aunt and mom arrived in their car. They told me to go into the house and close the door. I did what I was told, but I was still pretty scared of what might happen. It was only a few more moments when I heard a gunshot go off. That nearly made me piss myself. I was scared that Jack might have just shot my mom or aunt. Then though, I heard my aunt yelling at him to get lost, or her next shot would not be a warning shot. After a few moments, my mom and aunt rushed into the house. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that my aunt kept a rifle in her car. It was the sort of thing my family did, after all. I was, however, a bit worried when they took my other aunt to the hospital. They told me to keep the doors locked and use the gun in case Jack came back. I'd shot a gun a few times, and I was not really a fan. I spent quite a while looking out the windows, fearful Jack would return, but thankfully he never came back, and I did not have to use the gun that night. For the past year, I've encountered a buttload of crazy people, and have accumulated even more crazy stories. While most of them would make you laugh your butt off, the one I've chosen to share was terrifying while it was happening, and still gives me shivers whenever I think about it. A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store right across the street from my home. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college and decided to stay after I left school. This little store had almost served as a sort of savior for me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly, regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. When the time came that I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money, the corner store was the first place I went to look for a job. Turned out I was in luck. Only the day before, one of the employees had been fired for stealing from the register. I took his place, and I've been working here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell loads of alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat really. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, on one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night, about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had already made their appearances, a few more than once even. The two involved in this incident had been in around 7 p.m. and just returned. They were, or at least appeared to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood occasionally since I'd moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers ever since he'd bought it, and that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to suspect either could become violent. That night, something changed though. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quart and 40-ounce size beers. Nothing too out of the ordinary. All of a sudden though, an argument began between the two soon after they arrived. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about, but soon I began to hear everything they were screaming across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the woman began screaming curse words at the man, I felt I had to at least get them to take it outside instead. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do, but I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was even halfway there, the man began to scream back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him quite a lot. Mere moments before, he had grabbed a bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he began to strike at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would just break, or if he intended on killing her with the nearest thing he could, but strike after strike, he continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blame the entertainment industry for giving people a false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you, it's very hard. Following the 5th or 6th strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving altogether. The man stood over her with a blood-soaked bottle for a moment. He looked up when I assume he heard me sprinting towards them. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of the woman laying there made me sick to my stomach. Blood was dripping from her ears, but the most shocking thing was the growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her myself, so I made the decision to call the paramedics and let them check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly didn't seem in any hurry to get there, but when they did arrive 45 minutes later, I did my best to fill them in on all I'd seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling they were very familiar with these two. While on shift a few days later, my boss came in with some unfortunate news. The female was brain dead. Her family had made the choice to let her pass away. Unfortunately, it was now a murder. The cops had picked the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that had examined him said it's likely he truly may not even remember what he'd done. The many years of alcohol abuse had destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not even get the full punishment due him under the law. I'm not really sure how to feel about that, honestly. Sometimes it seems like people really do get away with murder. I serve as one of 2 managers for a local branch of a national convenience store chain. Starting as a wide-eyed 23-year-old girl, I worked my way up to night manager within 5 years. Not exactly a groundbreaking achievement, I admit, but still an achievement nonetheless. My job includes staying late after closing to count the night's drawers and drop the deposits for the day manager to put in the bank. I've never minded much having to do this job. The past 5 years working here has been on the night shift, and nothing really scary has ever happened while I was on the clock. The only holdup in the history of the store occurred during the daytime. Therefore, I'd never had any reason to fear working after dark. That was until just recently, when I became the subject of someone's obsession. Talking about this in the first place is very embarrassing for me. I feel like when people hear about this, they think I'm bragging about my looks or something, but I swear I'm not. I recognize that I'm an average-looking woman, but that's as far as my vanity goes. I would have kept this all to myself, but my therapist feels that sharing my experience will help other women. That's why we're here. Hopefully he's right, and this horrible ordeal can really serve to help others who suffered from the same form of negative attention. I guess it's time to tell you exactly what it is that happened. As I said, I work the night shift 6 days a week. The number of weirdos I encounter because of this is somewhat high. A fight once or twice a year, some homeless drunks, of course, the usual lot for a clerk in a convenience store in America. In spite of the craziness going on around me day to day, I managed to go unnoticed by any of those weirdos until around 6 months ago. At about that time, this particular man began coming to the store. Initially, it was only once or twice a week. Whenever he did, he wouldn't say anything to me either. As time passed on, his visits became more and more frequent. This, in itself, is not that odd. Anybody who's ever worked in a convenience store for any length of time can tell you that regulars come with the territory. Some people you'll see every day at the exact same time, some more than once even. So, at the time, I thought I was just developing a new regular. No need to be too concerned. A month into this routine, though, I noticed that he would always wait until I had 0 customers so I could ring him up personally. What made this so obvious was his concerted efforts to begin discussions with me. Although I found it funny then, I didn't realize I was encouraging him by engaging with him. Soon, the talks became much more personal, less banal discussions. The first time I was asked if I had a boyfriend, I laughed it off, but the third and fourth were the first indication to me that I might be having a problem on my hands. My suspicions were cemented on the day that he randomly asked me out. Perhaps out of instinct, I said no immediately. I was very careful to be kind in the way I said it though. In the moment, he seemed to take it well. However, another clerk told me later in that evening that the man was actually extremely angry. I guess I never really learned to read body language very well. The next time he came in, he refused to talk to me and didn't return to normal until a few days later, when he acted like nothing had ever happened. I got the impression he had decided to let it go. But just one day later, he asked me to go out with him again. This time, he said he meant it to be just friends, but once again, I declined. He made no efforts at all to hide his fury this time. The expression on his face as he stood there really frightened me. The week following this second incident, I spent most of my time hiding out in the office doing paperwork. A male clerk he seemed to have befriended told me he'd been repeatedly asking about me, but the clerk always just told him I was out. I took advantage of this friendship to ask the clerk to talk to the man on my behalf. I wanted him to ask the guy not to come in the store when I was working anymore. His most recent behavior had really scared me. They must have really had the discussion because I didn't see the guy after that for several days. Curious as to what was said, I asked the clerk what reaction the man had. He only answered by saying the man had severe anger problems and I should watch my back from now on. I'm not sure if that clerk thought that would make me feel any better, but obviously it made me far more scared. Still, the guy did stay away from the store during my shifts, and I didn't see him for a few weeks after. One day, during a shift change, I was talking to the day manager, and he mentioned a discussion he'd had with my stalker, as he called him. The manager made the remark in passing that he didn't normally see the man at that time of day, and the guy told him he'd stopped coming in on my shift because I thought I was too good for him. The manager said the man's eyes had blazed with anger as he said that. Certainly, I dodged a bullet. At least, that's what I thought initially. In the coming weeks, though, I would catch glimpses of him wandering through the parking lot. Sometimes he'd stand at the edge of the lot just out of sight of the lights and watch me for hours. The last time I caught him doing this, I called the cops. When they arrived, I explained the situation to them, but as you can imagine, they told me they couldn't do anything unless he blatantly threatened me. Of course, by the time they arrived, he was gone as well. I'm not sure, but I think calling the cops might have scared him a bit, because I didn't see him for a while after once again. Our last meeting was less than an hour after close, about a month ago. I had just finished the deposits and was preparing to leave the store. As I walked outside the office, heading to the door, I noticed the shadow of a person standing just outside the view of the lights, just as my stalker had done that one time. Terrified, I called the cops right away. There was no way I was going to leave the store alone at 12:50 a.m. with him waiting outside in the darkness. The cops showed up in less than 5 minutes, but naturally the guy had already hid. I got the usual speech, but they were at least kind enough to volunteer to come around for the next week or two at closing and hang around for a bit so I could lock up and drive away. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I heard the news. While I was engaging in work talk with the male clerk, he mentioned that my stalker had killed himself the week before. I didn't believe him, so we walked into the office and he brought the man's obituary up on the computer. Shocked would be an understatement. I knew I hadn't seen him since then, but I assumed the police presence at closing had just scared him off. It took me a few minutes to gather myself. I wasn't sure how to feel about this. While he clearly had become a danger to me, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Obviously, he had major anger issues, but I had no idea how bad his life had been outside the store. I've always often thought it was important to try and be empathetic towards others. On the other hand, though, the relief I felt and still feel often overrides any feelings of sadness or guilt I may have. I can only hope he's found as much peace in taking his life as I have. I know that sounds terrible, but honestly, can you blame me? Rest in peace. I truly hope you found the peace you so sorely needed.